Good. Well, Megan, glad to have you back on the show. I'm sure it's been a busy day for you. I saw you already had
It's
an
been a
article
crazy day.
up.
I've been wanting, yeah, from one place to another, like gathering pieces of information on this story. So it's very much a live developing story.
Great. Well, Megan, before we jump into anything on the story, you've shared quite a bit about your personal battle with cancer on social media. Any health updates or prayer updates for our listeners and for those many thousands of Christians out there who are praying for you and rooting for you in this?
Thank you for asking. Yeah, so I have surgery on February 3rd, thoracic surgery. They're going to take off a little part of my lung, and that has what we believe is a metastatic nodule. So hopefully that will halt this from spreading any further, and that will be the end of my cancer journey. But that does mean stage 4. So, that does lessen my odds. So I appreciate those prayers. And I'm actually looking into getting some treatment from Patrick Soon-Shiong's clinic in California. So hopefully that too will help me beat this cancer.
Well, thank you for continuing to work through it. We need your voice and pray that the Lord gives you strength. So that surgery is February 3rd.
Yep, that's right.
Okay. Well, folks, make sure to keep Megan in your prayers for the next few weeks and particularly on February 3rd. But you've not let cancer hold you back. So you had a story today at the Daily Wire connecting what happened at City's
Mhm.
Church in St. Paul, Minnesota to some other protest demonstrations. And I hate calling them protests because they're
Yeah,
so much
yeah.
worse than that. Agitators, disruptors, attacks. Attacks a pretty good word. So just talk to us briefly about that connection you found between some of these protests in DC and what happened yesterday at City's Church in Minnesota.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're getting very close to the point where we can call these domestic terrorists, because when you're storming into a church in the middle of service and you're terrorizing the congregants, you're screaming in their faces. I don't know if people have seen all of these videos, but you really should, because it's appalling. And part of what they did was, make the kids that were sitting in the service cry. I was told that the kids in particular were terrified and they had to shut down the service. And as I started looking around at, who are these protesters, I got in touch with our friend Joe Rigney, who was, of course, a founding pastor at City's Church and pastored there for, I think, about 7 years. And he was also helped plant Christ Church in DC and has preached there a number of times. And so he was able to tell me, hey, I recognize one of the key ringleaders there at that City's Church attack, a guy named William Kelly, who is a paid professional agitator. In fact, right now it's disturbing to see that he has a GoFundMe to continue these attacks on churches. And he specifically said that, he's doing it to attack, quote unquote, demons in these churches. And so he's raised $40,000 to continue this kind of harassment of Christians as they're trying to worship God. So he and his group, you will often see them standing on the streets in the Capitol outside of Christ Church, because War Secretary Pete Hegseth attends there. And those videos too are very appalling. They are screaming the F word, screaming obscenities at families as they're trying to enter the building, screaming at the children. At one point, I've been told that these amplification attacks, because, they're screaming through bullhorns, which they then further amplify, became so severe they actually shattered a church member's eardrum as he was trying to go into church, and he had to be rushed to the hospital. So, these aren't games. And Kelly was arrested, but he was quickly released. So he's back out on the streets to continue this kind of harassment and destruction. And, part of what's so disturbing is that we know that local Minnesota police were on the scene there at that church. They said they were monitoring the event, but they did not arrest anyone. So what you saw is clearly illegal, and yet Minnesota authorities did not arrest anyone. They said because they were trying to balance free speech rights against the rights of Christians to worship freely. But let's be very clear. Your free speech rights do not extend to storming into a church and terrorizing and interrupting the service.
Yeah, wow. So this guy William Kelly, does he have an organization? Like, or it's just sort of it's him doing it?
Yeah, I'm still looking into William Kelly. One thing we know is that these particular protesters that he was with, at least, are associated with Black Lives Matter, and it's the Racial Something Network, but it's another racial grievance group. And so, this is the kind of people who had already been on the ground in Minneapolis. They're the same people who were protesting against George Floyd. And so what you see is a group who are funded by the left. We know where Black Lives Matter got its money, not just from left-wing foundations, but, also from just about every major corporate organization in the US, from Walmart to Nike. So they've been very flush with cash. And so, these guys are paid to do this. And what I have heard is that they have just been sitting in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, where these George Floyd protests took place, and they just look for any trigger to go out and cause mayhem. So, before it was George Floyd, now it's Renee Good. But if you actually listen to what they're saying in the sanctuary of City's Church or in these protests, they don't clearly aren't there just to protest ICE. They don't have any, real legitimate grievances against ICE, because you saw them saying things like hands up, don't shoot. So they were repeatedly chanting that in this sanctuary. And that's a debunked slogan. That's a claim that Michael Brown back in 2015 or 14 in Ferguson, Missouri, was shot while he had his hands up. And we now know that that was not true. He was actually charging at a police officer when he was shot. But the point is that that's the kind of people that these protesters are. They are not people who are legitimately expressing their grievance about Renee Good. They're just glomming on to any particular, event in public life that they can use as an excuse to get out there and riot and cause trouble.
Yeah, and to particularly target Christians,
Right.
right? I mean, that really seems to. I listened to some of the interviews that Don Lemon was doing with these agitators, domestic terrorists, if that holds up, right? And really, they're saying, you shouldn't feel comfortable, and even this guy's language of attacking demons, it's this total inversion of Christian morality. They're trying to claim the Christian moral high ground for doing things like invading a church and terrorizing children, disrupting a worship service. And you're absolutely right. Their so-called First Amendment right to protest, which they do have, but it ends directly at the door of the church. They do not have the right to walk in there and disrupt this church service.
Yeah, I mean, if they wanted to hang out on the sidewalk, then fine. But what you cannot do is enter the building and do what they did. So I have no doubt that, federal charges are going to be coming here soon.
Yeah, we talked to Will Chamberlain and John Whitehead earlier about that, and it certainly looks like the federal charges are coming. Megan, one of the things I wanted to bring you on to talk about is just fascinating that it was a BLM protest, right? So, like, the great BLM bug comes back to bite Southern Baptists, and I want to be very clear about this. So let's make sure we do this charitably and fairly. We're not victim blaming City's Church in any way, shape, or form. They didn't do anything to deserve this. This was horrible, completely unjustified. And yet it is remarkable, I think, to you and to me and other people to see that this is really the fruit of the ideologies that have been welcomed into the Southern Baptist Convention. This was a Southern Baptist Convention church. And this is a fruit of compromise with things like BLM and on issues like immigration and ICE. So, what are some of the ways that sort of Southern Baptists have sort of foolishly compromise with some of these ideologies that one day grow up like the snake and bite us in incidents like yesterday?
Right. Yeah. As you were talking, by the way, I was looking up what that other group is, and it's the Racial Justice Network. So we have Black Lives Matter and the Racial Justice Network are part of the activists, paid activists who stormed this church. And I think that brings up a really good point, because while I'm unbelievably grieved to see what happened at City's Church, and I absolutely want to be clear about that, this is an ordinary Southern Baptist church. We love them. These are our brothers and sisters. And that is part of why it has been so frustrating to see the leadership at the national level of the Southern Baptist Convention, because that kind of leadership is what has contributed to what we unfortunately saw in St. Paul yesterday morning. So, we could go back to J.D. Greear sort of haranguing Christians to use the phrase Black Lives Matter when he was president of the Southern Baptist Convention. He said it was a gospel issue, that we needed to use the slogan Black Lives Matter. And he tried to claim that, well, I didn't align with Black Lives Matter. I just said we should use that slogan. But he did, in fact, say things like we need to overhaul our policing system and our criminal justice system because it's racially unjust and it's systemically racist. And so those were the kinds of things that contributed to empowering these organizations that are now terrorizing churches. And then even further than that, William, it was a little disturbing to me to see that our own Southern Baptist leadership issued a press release and an open statement back in April where they explicitly attacked the Trump administration, supposedly for its handling of ICE, and claiming that Christians are afraid of ICE and they're afraid of how ICE is going to come into churches. None of that was true. Let's be very clear. ICE has handled itself incredibly well when it's come to things like apprehending illegal immigrants and criminals who are connected with the church in some way. So they have sat in parking lots and they have worked with pastors and they have let them know, hey, we're out here. We'd like to interview some people. But at no point have they stormed into a church and raided it and started pulling people out of the church. They have done nothing like what we saw these agitators and these protesters do. And so that's why it's so disturbing when you see these statements. And I'll just read you a little bit of it. So this was the statement, that was put out in April by a number of leaders of various ethnic ministries within the Southern Baptist Convention. And we could have a talk about whether we should have these cordoned off ethnic ministries that aren't a part of the larger, broader body that we're interacting with. Should we have these little separate Asian ministries? And I don't know. That's something we can debate. But what they did was put out a statement with the ERLC and Brent Leatherwood, who was the head of it at the time. And they said that the threats of mass deportation by the Trump administration and its lack of assurance to churches that ICE agents will not enter churches to carry out immigration enforcement duties has caused fear to rise among both the guilty and the innocent. Attendance has dropped significantly, threatening religious liberty and immigrants' access to spiritual care in their local churches. So, none of these things were true. What they did was they took a prominent legacy media narrative that ICE was going to somehow be a threat to churches, and they magnified it and they amplified it. Brent Leatherwood went on to say, he's quoted in this statement, "I'm grateful that these pastors and leaders have put into words the experiences that so many of our fellow Southern Baptist brothers and sisters are living through right now." He says, many of these moves are consistent with elements of a comprehensive approach to border security. Yet, as these pastors have indicated, some of these actions are raising alarm and fear among those who are here legally. So what they were continuing to do, like I said, was just give aid and comfort to this anti-ICE narrative. And now we see what that has done. We have seen these agitators and these protesters, who Southern Baptist national leadership also coddled, have now invaded a church because they simply had a pastor on staff who also works for ICE, which is a perfectly biblical thing to do. It is biblical for a law enforcement officer to also work as a pastor. There is no reason that they should have been attacked for that. So that was a long spiel, but I hope that gives everybody the background so that they understand why it's so important to hold our Southern Baptist leaders accountable, because it does contribute to situations like this.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, we have seen for many years now, essentially national Southern Baptist leadership take a slightly Christianized version of the leftist narrative on immigration. I mean, and whether it's through the ERLC's work with the evangelical immigration table, which congratulations on your work helping to get that severed.
You as well.
Yeah, but I remember there was a fairly prominent Southern Baptist pastor, I'm forgetting his name, I think it was in Tennessee, who he spoke to this from the pulpit, and we made a big deal out of it, where he was warning about ICE in churches. And really, it's like, you are giving aid and comfort, you're adopting the propaganda of the enemy, when push comes to shove. What's really going to happen here are these Black Lives Matter, these leftists, these anti-ICE protesters are the ones who are going to be invading your churches instead. And so it's really important we flip the script. And Megan, do you think it's flipping? I mean, as you watch sort of the reaction to this, one of the things I said was, hey, look, it's great to see some of the big EVA SBC guys denounce this, but do they realize they've contributed to it? Is the culture going to actually change here? Are we winning? Are we losing? Are we in a draw? What are you seeing?
Yeah, well, I do think some things are shifting because, one, Brent Leatherwood is obviously not at the ERLC anymore. So, I think message received, and, he was a protege of Russell Moore, who did what Leatherwood did, but on steroids. So, he really furthered this leftist messaging. So I think the fact that, first Russell Moore left and then Brent Leatherwood quietly exited. So now we're in a moment, and I hope the ERLC sees this, and I hope they're listening, because the actions of that particular entity have been particularly odious to a lot of Southern rank and file Southern Baptists, undermining what we believe and what we feel. And I can understand that, certain individuals at the ERLC may have different convictions on some of these political issues. And I'm the first to say that a lot of them are debatable. And I'm happy to have those debates about what our immigration policy should look like. But what they shouldn't feel free to do is what they did in this statement, for example, which is denigrate ICE and further a false narrative that ICE is somehow a threat to churches, which is what they did. So I hope they are listening and they are aware that, look, we're going to keep talking about this kind of thing if you continue to do it. So what I'm hoping to see is when they select a new leader for the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, that man better represent the views of all Southern Baptists and no longer just the very actually small slice of Southern Baptists who tend to be squishier or on the more progressive side. So, that's one. I also have seen what I think we've kind of dubbed the Great Rehab Tour, where you see some of these leaders like J.D. Greear, who accommodated Black Lives Matter and other racial grievance groups in the past. They're now trying to sort of reset and reframe their records, and they're trying to claim like, I wasn't really a part of that, or I didn't really do that, which is funny because I go, if you believed in it, why don't you just say, yes, I believe that, and I still believe that, and I'm going to double down on it and tell you why this is where I stand, because I'm never afraid to do that. I'm always happy to tell you, hey, this is where I stand, this is why, and even if everyone else doesn't like it, I'm still going to stand here if I believe it's true. And that's not what you see with leaders like J.D. Greear and some of his compatriots who are now quickly trying to, reposition themselves and go, actually, we were over here the whole time, and you're misunderstanding what we meant when we said things like use the Black Lives Matter slogan, or when we did the same things that all of these racial grievance groups were doing, which was tear down statues and American history. We also saw Greear do things like try to erase Southern Baptist history by retiring the broadest gavel because it had once been owned by a pastor who was in the antebellum era of the South, though he did later repudiate slavery. So, we've seen things like that, and that is a positive. So I want to encourage that. But at the same time, I do feel like we need a change in leadership. I appreciate if those guys want to get, with the zeitgeist now, and they want to move themselves over to where it seems like Southern Baptist culture, Christian culture, and the American culture more broadly is going. But that is not enough for me. I'm glad, unless maybe if they came out and repented, if someone like a J.D. Greear or a Danny Aiken or some of these other guys would come out and say, you know what, we got caught up in a moment and it was a mistake and it was wrong, and we lacked discernment in that moment, and we refused to listen. We were very hard-headed about those who were trying to tell us how this conflicted with biblical principle, and who were trying to explain to us, people who had a little more knowledge of these organizations and what they stood for. We were arrogant and hard-headed, and we didn't listen to them. If they said that and said, we realize that now and we ask for forgiveness and we repent, I would be the first to do it. I would welcome that, but we haven't seen that. All we've seen is denial and repositioning. So, to me, that means that this continued effort to change the leadership at the Southern Baptist Convention needs to continue.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right about that. It really is a multi-year fight. What's happening in the SBC is sort of similar to what's going on with Trump world politics, right? When Trump won in 2016, that was not game, set, match. That was like the start of a multi-year effort. And then we got a setback, and now he's back. He's only been in for a year. I mean, we have a long way to go before we actually win anything. We are winning, but we have a long way to go until we win. Same with SBC. Like this election coming up in Orlando, and with somebody like Willie Rice running, I mean, that would be a huge win, but it's not the final victory. I mean, it's the start. Even since I've been streaming here, I've had a couple of people reach out and flag for me that there's a local Baptist association that's sending around like pamphlets encouraging illegals to help avoid deportation. Like that's being sent around SBC associations. I hear that at NAM and Send Network that they're still talking about ministering to illegal aliens without any reference to deporting them. And so, I mean, even on this, I mean, I hope this is a flashpoint. Megan, you are not just sort of an investigative reporter, you're also sort of like a cultural commentator, and you watch these things. Does an incident like yesterday, like how much will that go to sort of change things, or what would you say to people in terms of how it should change things? Because from what I understand, that church it's not like the William Wolf Church of
Right.
pro-ICE MAGA, right? And you look, that's not what my church is like anyway. But it's like, whether that church was far right or sort of seeker sensitive, third way, you're still going to get hit with this stuff. So like, what's the message here for churches in terms of like, now is just a time to plant a flag, stay strong, because the left at the end of the day isn't going to discriminate between JD Greer and William Wolf and Megan Basham. They're coming for us all.
Right. And I think that's the good point that, this was very much, as you said, I've been told as well, that this is not a culture warring type of church. I don't love that term, but you understand what I mean when I say that. This isn't this sort of pastor who writes op-eds in the New York Times or at the Daily Wire and is giving his political points of view. And we've all seen that, right? We've seen pastors who will be out there with protesters or who like to give interviews to media for various political positions, or who like to even attend rallies, whether for, Democrats or Republicans. This is not that kind of church. This was just a church quietly going about its worship service. And so I think that shows, as you said, that you're going to be targeted. You may not want to get involved in this stuff, but they're going to force you to pick a side. And that's where this third way thing, we see why it doesn't work in real life, is that policy has to be chosen. So it's great to say, I don't align with the left or right, but policies are policies. There are specifics. So what is your position going to be on whether law enforcement is allowed to enforce our immigration laws? And that's what we've seen, is that this great effort to prevent them from doing what legally they are allowed to do and biblically they are sanctioned to do, which is ensure the safety of their own citizens and to ensure that, we don't have rampant law breaking when it comes to our immigration system. So, biblically, there is nothing wrong and everything right with what ICE is doing, and we should applaud them. And so, that is really what I see here, is that you're not going to be able to avoid this, because even if you just have a member at your church who works for ICE or is an ICE official, eventually probably maybe somebody who's expressed views favorable of ICE, they're coming after you. So I don't remember who it was that said it, but that, famous maxim that you may not be interested in politics, but politics is interested in you. And that's not a dirty thing. That's the other thing I want to say. It is not a dirty thing for Christians to be involved in politics. The exact opposite. We have an obligation to work for the good of the cities that we live in. And part of that is ensuring law and order. So, I see nothing inconsistent and everything that is consistent with supporting ICE and their immigration efforts. So, I really hope that this serves as a wake-up call to a lot of great pastors out there who understandably, they don't want to be targeted with this. They don't want to have to speak up on this particular issue, but you may not have a choice.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we will ultimately have a choice, and I would say, I think you're saying this too, but I would say not only, of course, is ICE like legally, permitted to, like they're legally obligated to. So
Right.
ICE is legally obligated to remove, illegals from the United States of America. And they're targeting, they are targeting everybody, but they are targeting some of the worst, right? These are abusers, they're rapists, they're traffickers, they're drug traffickers. Also every time they throw up one of these rap sheets, I'm like, oh my goodness, this is who World Relief and Phil Vischer and Mike Cosper and Christianity Today, this is who you're defending. This is who you're telling me to welcome. This guy who has like abused an 11-year-old and has like 3 counts of drug trafficking. Like, this is who I'm supposed to side with over my American citizens. So not only are they legally, commanded to, they're biblically commanded to too, right? Like, this is part of Romans 13, 1-7. And so with our last little bit of time here though, Megan, like, a lot of people are familiar with your book, but one of the issues here is that for many years, the left has funneled tons of money into evangelical denominations, the Southern Baptist Convention in particular, to get us to essentially side with illegals over American citizens. So, just remind us on some of those top points there of like this intentional effort to get the evangelical right to be anti-ICE, to be anti-immigration enforcement, what that's looked like, and sort of how we can be aware when it's happening to us.
Yeah, I can actually give you an example from just this weekend that kind of underlined the point of my book. I was visiting a Calvary Chapel church in Las Vegas, Calvary Red Rock. And, that's not a Southern Baptist church, but it is a biblically faithful, doctrinally sound denomination, Calvary churches. So, it was great to talk with them. And one of the things they told me, this was their pro-life conference, is that for a pro-life bill that is live right now in Nevada, they said Planned Parenthood and other groups had given millions of dollars to getting this piece of legislation across the line. And in the meantime, they are fighting it with like a mere 250 grand that they were able to raise. And so that has been kind of the consistent David and Goliath story that we have seen on so many of these issues throughout the church, is that you have these left-wing um, multi billionaire organizations who are funneling money into these biblically debatable issues, things like immigration. They're pushing for open borders and amnesty policies, things like climate change legislation. They're pushing for, energy and fuel regulations. And so things that normally a conservative wouldn't want, but, they sort of cloak it in churchy language. They set up these AstroTurf front groups that always have the name evangelical in the title. So it'll be something like Evangelical Immigration Table or Evangelical Environmental Network. And, so this money comes from people like George Soros, the Clinton Foundation, the Rockefellers, and they disguise it as Bible studies and Bible study curriculum, and they're funneling it into churches through all of these ministries, including really large, well-known organizations like the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities. They're pumping it onto Christian campuses with this funding from left-wing donors. And again, the ordinary people who tend to be much more conservative than their leadership has no idea that that's happening. So, suddenly they show up to church one Sunday morning and they find out, okay, we're going to do a series on loving our immigrant neighbor. And we're going to have these cherry picked Bible verses that don't deal with passages in the Old Testament that say there are different kinds of immigrants. There are those who come to bless, but there are those who come to be a burden to the society. And you shouldn't take those who are coming to be a burden. And that immigrants must assimilate. They don't cover those passages. They're just dealing with a very surface level, cherry picked welcome the stranger, which was a command to Christians, not to governments. So, that's the kind of thing that I cover in my book. And it's certainly part of the dynamic we see playing out here. And this is just another example because, these agitators that storm City's church are absolutely well funded through groups like Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, and obviously through their own GoFundMe's too. I mean, it's just
Yeah.
it's so crazy. Back to what you started with, that there's this guy going around in multiple jurisdictions, Washington D.C., St. Paul, Minnesota, raising funds to agitate and to disrupt churches and Christians and conservatives. I mean, I hope the Department of Justice is listening to this and takes a look at that guy. Right? It
Yeah.
sounds like they're taking a look at other things. I feel like the response from the administration yesterday was incredibly positive. I mean, I have to say, like, it's a pretty big highlight of Center for Baptist Leadership to get reposted by the official ICE account and Heart Meet Dylan as well. So, I mean, they were clearly paying attention. It wasn't just us. Tons of other people were engaging on this too. So
I didn't see that. I'll have to go look for it.
no, it's okay. So like, but there are a lot of people out there who are frustrated and want more. And we talked about this at the start of the hour, but sort of like, what would your sort of encouragement be to conservatives and to Christians out there as they're watching this and longing for justice, to let the Trump administration work? What do we do in the meantime?
One of the things I would really like to see, because I think there's this tendency from Christians and from churches that once the fiery moment has passed, they're like, let's just move on. But we actually do need to see justice done here so that these kind of incidents don't happen in the future. So, one of the first things I want to say is that people do need to be prosecuted and jailed here. This has to stop because it's not just about you and your church. It's going to continue if you don't press charges to the full extent of the law. So, that's something I absolutely want to see. And I think that you are seeing an understandable frustration among conservatives who really want to see some action here. And I believe Harmeet Dillon and I believe Pam Bondi when they say that they are investigating and they're going to bring charges. But, they're fighting uphill because obviously Minnesota officials have made it clear they're not going to hold anyone responsible for this. So it's either going to be federal charges or nothing. And I think that absolutely needs to happen. But to the churches out there who are targeted, I really think I understand you don't want to be involved in this, but these prosecutions need to happen for the good of your neighbors. So please, don't drop the ball on this. Prosecute, ensure that people understand what happened at your church so that it doesn't happen to others.
Yeah, well said. I mean, really, the complete inverse of so much of what we have heard over the last decade is not love your neighbor, welcome the stranger. It's love your neighbor, support your local ICE agent.
Right.
Love your neighbor. Cheer on mass deportations. I mean, because really, these are the worst of the worst, and there's so many other things we could talk about. We'll have to have you back on sometime to talk about world relief and that whole
There's so
scam
much
and
to say.
gambit
Yeah.
there. But thank you so much for joining us. Megan, where can people keep up with what you're doing, your reporting, and everything else you're producing here?
Yeah, so you can always find me at Daily Wire. Had some breaking reporting yesterday on this story, and Morning Wire, which is our daily news podcast, 15 minutes straight news. I'm there usually 3-4 times a week. And I'm on all social media, but I tend to hang around the most, somewhat addictively so, on X. So you can find me on X at Meg Basham.
Great. Thanks, Megan. Thank you so much for your work, folks. Make sure to pray for Megan, and I'm sure she wouldn't mind hearing a friendly note that you are praying
Absolutely.
for here in the weeks ahead. All right, Megan, take care. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much.
The Center for Baptist Leadership podcast is powered by American Reformer, hosted by William Wolfe, with audio production by Jared Cummings. Our music is a custom remix of Soldiers of Christ in Truth Arrayed, the official hymn of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. To help CBL reform and revitalize Christian institutions, please consider making a generous donation today at centerforbaptistleadership.org.